So I'd like to ask Andrew to start off. He's an award-winning investigative journalist and contributing reporter for Foreign Correspondent and Four Corners. And in May 2010, he published a book on Wikileaks, The Most Dangerous Man in the World.
Hi there. The question is, could Wikileaks better protect its Cablegate source? And I think the simple answer to that is that it's impossible to protect somebody who gives themselves up. And if Bradley Manning was the source, and Bradley Manning in fact gave himself up to somebody who turned him into the authorities, and looking at the question more broadly and looking at how the source itself was protected, WikiLeaks went out of their way to protect if Manning was the source, and let's say that he was, so let's just call it Manning. What they did was they decided to publish the cables in January at one time. It was January 2011. What happened was things got out of hand and Manning was arrested, and so they had to make a decision to go with them earlier. Now you could argue that by publishing the cables they revealed Manning as being the source, because you could just vector the cables and see who accessed all these cables at one time, and it was evidence against Manning. But weighed against that is the fact that Manning actually wanted, according to the chat logs, wanted the maximum impact. Play into that the fact that Julian Assange and the general WikiLeaks troop was being hunted around Australia and around the world, and they genuinely feared for their lives. It's understandable why they did publish when they did. So I think it's like a question of whether or not Manning could have been better protected. I would suggest that he probably couldn't have been, since if he was the leaker, outed himself. On the question of scientific journalism, which is the other buzz phrase that's used, this so-called scientific journalism, which is where you publish all your source material on the net and then people can see it, is a very good thing. And giving it the name scientific journalism, I think, helps us sort of think about it a little more than just talking about putting your source material up there. And I think scientific journalism is one of Julian Assange's particular phrases that he uses. A good example of where this works is the London Daily Telegraph that published a story this year just after Osama bin Laden was killed, and they published a story saying that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's the supposed architect of 9/11 and a conspirator in just about every other atrocity that the Americans have been trying to track down over the past few years, and they ran a story which said that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had confessed to his US interrogators that there would be a nuclear attack on American soil if Osama bin Laden was either captured or killed. Now, that was a great story. Here we are, Osama bin Laden's dead, and here we've got this guy saying, yep, he in fact, there will be a nuclear attack on America. So what was wrong about that, of course, was that he hadn't said that. What the Telegraph had done in its haste to publish, very quickly I'd suggest, they'd conflated two statements that they got from the WikiLeaks cables, put them together and put them into the mouth of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. I mean, maybe it's something that could happen to anybody conflating this material. Now, what was important is that the material was actually on the net. They published the cables. That's the Daily Telegraph in London. And they went to the telly, by the way, because they had a huge falling out with the Guardian and couldn't stand him anymore. So they went across to the Tory graph, as it's called, the Telegraph. The Telegraph published the cables, and readers could then look at the cables and see that the error had been made in the story. So there you were, actually able to say, hey, they got it wrong, and I can see they got it wrong. And in fact, the Telegraph then corrected that story later on. So it's a good example, I think, of the pluses of so-called scientific journalism. And it's something that, in our own small way, we're all affected by, because when I first joined Four Corners in the mid-1990s, people would ring up and say, could they have a copy of the script, which had just been broadcast across Australia? And we'd say, what do you want it for? Because we would think that maybe they were going to sue us, or send a letter in and complain, and we go through the whole complaints procedure. So you try not to give it out. And now, in fact, the transcript of the actual program goes out almost live, in fact, with the story that's broadcast. So we've come a long way. Look, dealing with sources is the big one, and that's the one that's really difficult. In the case of Bradley Manning, the problem that they really had with Bradley Manning, excuse me, the problem they had with Manning, or Manning had if Manning was the leaker, the biggest thing, I think, the biggest problem they had was that he was alone and he needed to have human contact. Now, in the old days, when I was growing up as a journalist, you met your source, you eyeballed the source, you listened to them with their interminable stories of marital discord or alcoholism or drug abuse by their kids, whatever it was. It went on and on and on. You formed a relationship. They got to understand you. You got to understand them. Now, that's a good and bad thing in journalism. What happens now is that it's possible to dump, as we know, like 500,000 documents out there onto Wikileaks, and it's possible for the recipient not to know who sent them. Now, that's a kind of a good thing because it's anonymous. The person's anonymous. They can dump stuff. They feel safe about it, but they have to live with themselves. And sources always leak for a purpose. They leak usually for maximum political impact to get a change. They're going to risk everything, and they want to be sure that it's worth risking. And as they sit there, having dumped their 500,000 docos out there in the desert, they sit back and think, I wonder if they're actually going to run anything on this bloody stuff, and how they're going to do it, because every source wants to influence the story. They want the story to be told their way. And so the very strength of anonymity is also the greatest potential weakness of WikiLeaks. And so when things went a bit rocky between Assange and Manning, and Manning was worried about what was happening, he reached out in cyberspace to somebody who was an avowed supporter of freedom of information and freedom of the media and all those wonderful First Amendment things that the Americans have, a guy called Adrian Lamo. And Adrian Lamo was the worst person in the world you should reach out to because, among other things, he was a friend of military intelligence in the United States. And he handed over Bradley Manning to the FBI, military intelligence. And as we now know, the rest is kind of history in that area. So when you're looking at being in a nice dark room with a flickering screen and all these documents and thinking how easy it is just to flick them off into cyberspace, it's not easy because you've still got to live with yourself, and that's the advice I give to anyone who's thinking of leaking any documents. If you do have any documents, print them out and just give them to me.
Do we have any questions for Andrew? Okay, well, I've got one. How do you, with all the stuff with the Telegraph that you spoke about, how do you think that WikiLeaks is actually changing audiences' expectations of being able to access, I guess more than just reading the transcripts, of actually being able to perhaps see your research for a story?
Look, I just think audiences are completely cynical and sceptical about what they see and what they read. There's a kind of a professional cynicism in the community, and I understand that. But there's also a desire to understand what stands behind the story, and I think that the internet allows us now as journalists to be far more open. We're out of the cage. There's not a problem anymore. We can give as freely as we can all information that we hold, and that's got to be a good thing because people are educated and they're cynical about journalism, and I think they have every right to be.
Do you have a question?
I have a question. From the WikiLeaks website, we found that that WikiLeaks publishing that document is reserved for the right of public opinion to get information. But I have questioned that by which way we could define the public interest and public opinion so that we can decide which information should be published. And to some extent, journalism could share the same view with public opinion in getting information.
Yeah, it's the age-old question. Other people here are, I think, better able to talk about those issues than me, but my view is that there are a very, very small number of secrets that need to be kept. I don't know, maybe a handful, maybe one or two. Paul Barrett, who's a former Secretary of Defence here in Australia, expressed a kind of similar view. there are very, very few secrets. Most of the stuff that's stamped top secret, no foreign, all the rest of it is just stuff that's used. It's there to cover your arse, basically. Stamped top secret so that it sounds better. I mean, it's like most of the stuff that you're reading on Wikileaks. I mean, you can see the material that's classified as secret and classified and no foreigners, and you ask yourself, why on earth is this so? I mean, the only stuff we've seen so far has been beneficial, from what I can make of it, in Tunisia and in Egypt. So the answer to your question is, I think that the bar is very low. Is very low on what should be secret. Most material should be open, far more open than it is. And if anything comes out of this, maybe it'll be a reclassification of what is in the public interest and what is not in the public interest. And certainly it should be changed to allow the public to have more open access to information.
That probably leads us nicely into our second speaker on the panel, which is Brian Toohey, who's a journalist with the Australian Financial Review. Brian's probably one of Australia's best-known investigative journalists, and he has spent a lot of time writing about issues to do with ASIO, defence, writing a lot, working all through the 80s, writing about the Cold War and military intelligence, you know, when documents actually and intelligence sort of were much more hidden than today.
Thanks. Sensible political leaders would respond to the WikiLeaks release of those 250,000 US diplomatic cables by vowing to be more open in the first place. They won't, of course. Yet, with few exceptions, secrecy does more harm than good, expanding state power, concealing illegal behaviour and fostering dangerous suspicions and mistrust between nations. But politicians' instinctive response to leaks, other than those that they do themselves, is to tighten secrecy in the hope that this will give them more control over often uncontrollable events. Secrecy can restrict opportunities to avoid... Is that right? Yeah. Let's say I just hold the thing, wouldn't that be better? Yeah. Secrecy can restrict opportunities to avoid bad outcomes, as demonstrated by the failure to pull together the clues about the planned terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001. Those with power can also distort the need-to-know principle to hide an awkward truth, as occurred when skilled British Defence Department analysts were denied access to the rubbish masquerading as intelligence about Iraq's possessions of weapons of mass destruction. Had they been given access, or if the shonky intelligence had leaked, this would have stripped the then British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, and his Australian counterpart, John Howard, of their claim at the time that only the existence of these weapons provided sufficient justification to invade Iraq in violation of Article 1 of the ANZUS Treaty and the NATO Treaty. In contrast, President Kennedy said in hindsight that he might have abandoned the planned Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in 1961 if the media had published more leaked material before the debacle occurred. Other policymakers have taken more timely advantage of the gains from abandoning secrecy. President Nixon and his Soviet counterpart Brezhnev agreed to stop encrypting the data from missile tests under a 1972 treaty to reduce the number of nuclear warheads and delivery systems. This commitment to openness reduced unfounded suspicions about cheating on the treaty. Often secrecy gives officials undue confidence that they have a superior understanding of the world because they see classified documents. A former US official, Daniel Ellsberg, has recounted that after joining the Pentagon, he no longer listened to a knowledgeable friend from Harvard. Ellsberg said he fell into the trap of thinking that because he had 15 levels of clearance beyond top secret, there was nothing that he could learn from one of the nation's leading scholars. Ellsberg, of course, later leaked a copy of the Pentagon Papers, the top secret official study of the Vietnam War. After the government took legal action against the newspaper, the Supreme Court backed the decision to publish. In a decision that Julia Gillard should take note upon before she makes more derogatory comments about WikiLeaks, Judge Potter Stewart said in that case, "The only effective restraint upon executive power in the areas of national defence and international affairs may lie in an enlightened citizenry, in an informed and critical public which alone can protect the values of democratic government. In other words, you can't leave that protection to Julia Gillard and co. But Australia's Attorney-General Robert McClellan said he was considering prosecuting WikiLeaks. The AFP later decided that Julian Assange, an Australian citizen of course, had not broken any Australian laws. But no Australian politician has criticised calls from their US counterparts for Assange to be murdered, with one exception, and that is Malcolm Turnbull, who has spoken out against the lack of action by the Australian government on that. Although secrecy is often justified when protecting the identity of sources, the US military distributed the names of informants in Iraq and Afghanistan to hundreds of thousands of troops and contractors. In an astonishing security breach, the military failed to follow the standard practice of intelligence services and give informants a pseudonym, even in encrypted communications. That means that even if the text is decoded, the informant's name remains secret. WikiLeaks deleted the informant's name from its documents on Iraq, but it's widely condemned for not doing so in its earlier release of material on the Afghan war. The same is now occurring when it's dumped out the massive remainder of the diplomatic cables from the State Department. But the moral responsibility does not rest, despite many claims to the contrary, with WikiLeaks. The moral responsibility for failing to protect these sources lies squarely with the US military and the State Department for not following elementary procedures in this regard. The Pentagon, in fact, acknowledges there is no evidence that the WikiLeaks publication has killed anyone, but the leaks did provide new information about contentious special operations by Western troops, similar to the one in which Australian troops killed 5 children in a raid on an Afghan home in 2009. Yet the State Department claimed that countless numbers of individuals would be killed. The Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, even complained that the leaks, quotes, tore at the fabric, unquotes, of good government. It's not clear what Clinton thinks of the damage done when the US kidnaps innocent people, then demands that the perpetrators not be prosecuted. Yet a leaked 2007 WikiLeaks cables shows that a senior American diplomat bluntly told a German government advisor that issuing warrants for the arrest of CIA officials involved in kidnapping a German citizen, Khaled al-Masri, would harm relations with the US. Al-Masri was tortured at length before his captors released him after realising they had the wrong person. The US pressure, however, ensured that the German government did not go ahead with the arrest. WikiLeaks, and this is a point that I think has been made but needs to be made again, because I heard only the other day some professor at the University of New South Wales slamming into WikiLeaks for not gathering material from other countries, or many other countries other than the US. But the whole point is that they have no control, WikiLeaks has no control whatsoever over who gives them information or where it comes from. And Assange has said that he'd like to expose more Russian and Chinese information because he believes it would help reform in those countries. But he has no control over that because that's the way in which WikiLeaks works. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. Any questions for Brian?
Just for the last point, as you said, Brian, you said that WikiLeaks, they don't have any control over publishing material, but I think that they have control over what do they publish. And I read in the book by Daniel Domschneidberg, Inside WikiLeaks, that Julian Assange decides on what they publish for the maximum effect. So as a result, there are lots of cables which end up unpublished because he just thinks they are not important enough. What do you say to that?
My answer to that is that's a good thing. They have, my point was they have no control over what information they receive. Of course they could decide not to publish it, to censor it, but I can see no point in doing that whatsoever. Where they had the time to do so, they did black out the names of the informants in relation to, so-called informants in relation to Afghanistan. Now, clearly they haven't had time it seems they've decided to dump the rest of these cables, but no one's been killed. This is all nonsense. This is what governments always bleat about, how, you know, someone's life will be at risk. The Pentagon has pointed out no one's been killed by anything that's been published yet. And I assume that's because they're embarrassed. It is their fault that these names are not protected. There's a very simple way to protect the names. You give, and this is what the intelligence services do. They would never dream of sending off a cable in which they referred to an informant by their real name. What they do is give them a pseudonym. Then when you encrypt that material, that's further protection. But then when someone decodes the encrypted material, it still doesn't help them know the name of the informant, because all they can find is the code word, and there's no way of decrypting that. So I cannot believe that the State Department would genuinely put the names of genuine informants, serious informants, in a cable. None of the cables I've ever seen from the Australian Foreign Affairs Department have done that. None of the cables from none of the materials sent by the intelligence services ever do that. As far as I know, the Australian Defence Department has never done that. The people who need a huge boot up the bum on this is the State Department, if there's a problem, and the US military. Julian Assange can't judge. He's in no position to judge whether anyone's going to be killed by this sort of thing. Don't forget, a lot of other people have been killed as a result of this information too, deliberately killed by the US military and the US intelligence services.
If you're watching the webcast, you can ask any of the panellists a question by using the hashtag #ACIJinvestigate on Twitter. Our third panellist today is Antony Loewenstein. He's an independent journalist and author. He's the author of 2 best-selling books, My Israel Question and The Blogging Revolution.
Thank you. I wanted to start off by taking a bit of a different tack today and to saying that as a journalist who's written about WikiLeaks since 2006, pretty much when they started in the late part of that year, there's no question to me that WikiLeaks has been a force for good for journalism and for the world, with all the issues and faults that both the first 2 speakers have talked about. Assange has said a few times in the last few years that why has my website, WikiLeaks, had more leaks in 5 years than most of the corporate press, in fact all the corporate press in the West combined for the last 30. And he's right, there's not even a comparison. Yes, he may well have Bradley Manning, he may well have had sources who've given him hundreds of thousands of documents, but what it shows up to me very clearly is the consistent and regular failings of the corporate press to actually hold governments and powerful interests to account. And WikiLeaks is showing them up, which I think has a lot to do with the fact of how many in the corporate press, but also elements in the so-called think tank world, the wank tank world, are upset about the fact that their power is being challenged. And what's interesting is that when you've seen the reporting in the last years about the WikiLeaks cables and Afghan war logs, Iraq war logs and information before that, you regularly always have the way the corporate press frames this is, WikiLeaks documents say this, the State Department, US government / official person says this. And one of the things that both the first 2 speakers have pointed out is that we're told constantly that the threat of this information coming out will be the loss of individuals' lives. And both the first 2 speakers have said that hasn't happened. In fact, there's been a few investigations even in the last few weeks since the unredacted cables were unleashed on the world. One by Associated Press I have here, and one also by a publication in China, believe it or not. Both examples showing how thus far, and one can't guarantee there'll be no harm to people, we can't predict the future, but there's been no evidence whatsoever that individuals whose names are mentioned in the cables have been harmed. In fact, often the opposite is true. The Associated Press said a few days ago, and I quote, "The AP's review of the sources found several of these people were comfortable with their names in the open and no one fearing death. Others are dead, their names cited as sensitive in the context of long-resolved conflicts. Some have written or testified at hearings about the supposedly confidential information that provided the US government." So it's a far more complex picture than what we're being told by those who are endangering people in the first place. Much of the corporate press and the mainstream coverage turns WikiLeaks on its head. The danger that's coming here are the policies that are exposed in the cables, not the fact that the cables are coming out talking about the abuses. The issue clearly needs to be the range of problems that WikiLeaks cables have discussed over a range of issues. I particularly write a lot about Israel-Palestine, and there are countless documents that have been released in the last 6 months detailing the intimate relationship between Egypt, America, Israel, things we knew about in a general sense, but not the actual detail of it. And to me, a serious media, which I don't think we generally have, would actually analyse cables in a way that doesn't simply provide a two-side story. The official version says this, WikiLeaks says this. The cables speak for themselves. One should be sceptical about the fact that they're obviously written by US officials. They have, they might have their own spin on a situation. That's true, but it's not a question of there are two equal sides here. I mean, WikiLeaks, the reason so many in the corporate press are so embarrassed and governments are so ashamed of, their secrets are out. And that makes people in power very uncomfortable. One of the things I think that clearly comes out of WikiLeaks also is the importance of the independent press. And although WikiLeaks was releasing cables and information since 2006 when they first began, as many of you will be aware, Assange realised last year that he wasn't getting as much bang for his buck as he wanted and therefore went into partnership. New York Times, The Guardian, a few others. Now, those relationships ended, you might say, rather badly. But the result of that was that he still felt that the mainstream press played a role. And he's often been accused, in my view, fairly and unfairly, of rather than releasing all the documents at once, which he now has done, but initially they didn't, releasing it bit by bit, which goes against what many argued was WikiLeaks' modus operandi, namely, put the information out there and people can judge it as they will. And I think what we need to encourage in the mainstream media, which is going to exist, unfortunately, for a few more years, is to actually say to ourselves, if the mainstream press exists, why are they not getting most of these leaks? Why is it requiring a startup website by an Australian guy to get this kind of information? And the question I think we have to ask ourselves also, and to ask the mainstream press, is why aren't they establishing their own WikiLeaks-style sites? The Wall Street Journal about 6 months ago, in its typically incompetent way, launched an attempt at a WikiLeaks site, which was an idea to say, you should give us important information and we will judge it accordingly. Well, it was revealed within about 10 minutes of it being launched that it was so full of flaws that the Wall Street Journal, owned by Rupert Murdoch, would have personal information, not him necessarily personally, but the organisation would have information of those who were leaking it, which rather defeats the purpose in the first place. So my point being that surely it's the responsibility, if they see themselves as establishment media with a role, Fairfax, News Limited, even the ABC, of establishing WikiLeaks-type sites. And the reason I would argue many of them haven't done that, not saying this in a conspiratorial sense, is they don't want to lose the power. The power that mainstream corporate journalists have at the moment is they choose what's important. They make the decisions, what we see and what we don't see. And the threat to me, which I think is a wonderful thing, to the corporate press, is it actually gives a general public a chance to see what stories they aren't getting, the perspectives they aren't seeing. As Andrew rightly said, the fact that we can now see many documents, cables, etc. released gives us, the general public, far more information and power, which threatens the dominance that's lasted for so long and the collusion that exists between many in the corporate press and the government itself. It seems to me that in many ways, what WikiLeaks is starting to do is launching WikiLeaks-type sites elsewhere. There's a site called GreenLeaks in Germany, which hasn't really done much, but will. OpenLeaks has been thus far a disaster because nothing really has happened. And that was started by a former colleague of Assange, Daniel Domscheit-Berg. They had what can only be called an unbelievably bad love tiff and falling out. He's now kind of gone rogue, and the whole situation's a complete debacle. But my point is there are many WikiLeaks-type sites starting. And one of the things independent media is doing, particularly many blogs in various countries and many publications in various countries, is localising the cables, localising information in a way that actually gives context for that particular country. So, for example, although in the last 6 months you haven't read as much of the cables in, say, the Western corporate press, what WikiLeaks has been doing is partnering with, I think, about 90 media outlets in a range of countries, first world countries, third world countries, a range of places, and being specific about what WikiLeaks is able to disclose about those places. And I think numerous blogs and other sites have been drilling down into particular areas. So, for example, a number of sites in the US which are focusing on the Israel-Palestine conflict, the cables, the reams of cables detailing that particular conflict. So there's a role in some ways for the independent press, bloggers, and many of us here who aren't necessarily in the mainstream media all the time at least, to actually utilise this material in a way that's not simply as parochial. Most of the coverage in most Western countries has been rather based on what is being talked about at that country, Australia, America, Britain, which is obviously interesting. I'm not saying it's not, but it seems that if we have an idea and a belief that the internet actually should be used to its full potential, it still seems to me unbelievably retarded that we have a situation where the only cables we're generally reading about in the Australian press, and this is no criticism of what Philip's done at all, it's more of a general point, is that it's relating generally to Australia. Why aren't we having a situation in much of the mainstream media here of massive examination by citizens who are able to post information? Why does it have to be done by professional journalists? There's no particular reason why a cable can't be read by you or me. You look at most of the cables, you do a search, you can find it. Now, I'm not saying every single cable has news. Some does, some doesn't. But the information is there. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand them. It takes someone with an idea of an issue to pull out an angle. I accept that. But in a wider context, there's no reason why many of us, and indeed more importantly the mainstream press, aren't actually doing their job, which is to give us, the public, a far greater view than simply one story a day. There is no reason why we shouldn't have on most of the mainstream news sites, News, Fairfax, ABC, 9MSN, a far more interactive site that allows both a professional interaction and a citizen journalist interaction to understand what's being said, what the cables are saying. There's no reason why it's not happening, and to me it's not happening because A, the argument is not enough resources, but I think the other reason is more a fear of losing power. Many in the mainstream press realise that the models of corporate journalism are breaking down, their hold on maintaining an illusion of influence is decreasing, which I think is a wonderful thing. And therefore, the result surely should be that we should be, as independent journalists, calling and demanding, and if it's not happening, we're doing it ourselves, a far more interactive and assertive way of understanding what leaking should be, and putting spaces out, just finally, putting websites out that allow a WikiLeaks-style leaking of information that interests us. It may be about local government, it could be about foreign affairs, it could be about a range of things. And thus far, I don't really see that here or in many other corporate news organisations.
Thanks, Antony. Does anyone have any questions for Antony? I just wondered, you talked about how it was a loss of power sort of for the mainstream media, but do you also think there's something about the power of WikiLeaks as a brand, like it's sort of become this really cool thing? Do you think that sort of has something to do with it?
I think it's unfortunate that they're all walking out after us.
Yeah.
I've heard you now, I can go now, bye. I think there is a sense that it's unfortunate, this has happened for a range of reasons which we won't go into, that WikiLeaks is now overly associated with the personal problems of Julian Assange. Now, the personal issues with Assange are complex, we don't have to canvass them here, but there is no doubt that for WikiLeaks to get to where it is today would require someone with a huge ego. There's no other way WikiLeaks would have existed as it does. Assange obviously has that. We can be critical of elements of how he's done things, and I think no one's beyond criticism at all. There is certainly a brand that exists now. They're selling T-shirts and dinners with Julian to raise money because they're in need of cash, but there also surely then is an opportunity for other organisations to spring up to do similar work in different areas, and I think that opportunity is still very much out there, which most of the mainstream press is not doing.
Your question?
Yep, it's probably just a little bit more of a statement. I couldn't agree with you more with what you've been saying. I think one of the key issues that doesn't get discussed or gets skirted around is the actual effect of corporate control over the media. And I think with the role of advertising, the way it influences the actual editorial content is a huge issue that doesn't really get discussed. And I think it's no coincidence with what's happening in the UK at the moment with News Limited. Just another thing I'd wanted to mention as well too was in the late 90s I was involved with a group of people in getting indie media going, which is now an independent media network in over 200 cities around the world. One interesting issue that we found with this is it's an open source publishing site, as I said, has spread around. What it actually taught people, I think initially, this is days before Facebook, etc., is to actually question what they're reading. And I think media, by and large, is subjective. A story that's covered, say, in Australia about Papua New Guinea is going to have a very different perspective in Papua New Guinea as opposed to over here. So I think the key issue is that we've got to question what we actually read. I think that's...
Well, I think that's probably a great point to go to Philip Dorling as our final speaker today. And for many of us, Philip's actually the person who brought Wikileaks and Julian Assange to our attention, at least through his writings in the Fairfax press last year. He's a former diplomat, political staffer and senior public servant. He was National Affairs Correspondent for the Canberra Times from 2008 to 2010. He's now a contributing correspondent with The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. And of course, in November 2010, he secured access to the secret US embassy cables that were leaked to WikiLeaks that, of course, ran across our press for such a long period of time. Philip.
Thank you. The last questioner made the point about that people should question things and should question the information in front of them. And I suppose that's what's kept me engaged on what's a fairly wayward career, but it was basically a question of avoiding boredom. Basically, life's a struggle against boredom, and journalism provides an outlet to avoid boredom because you hopefully earn a decent living and get paid to ask interesting questions and hopefully find the answers. But it doesn't mean that everything that's served up to you, or even that you find, is necessarily what it appears to be or is necessarily the truth. I suppose, if the panel will indulge me briefly, I might actually slightly elaborate on my bio, because it sort of illustrates my own perspective on WikiLeaks, which has engaged me for much of the last, well, for more than a year now. I'm a latecomer to journalism. I've only been a journalist for 3 years. Prior to that, I basically sat on all sides of the fence. I've been an academic. I've been a diplomat. So I've written diplomatic cables and read secret intelligence reports and authored them. I actually started as an historian with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, publishing historical volumes of diplomatic cables for the historical record and shifting through the files and pulling out what was important and sorting through the dross to find out what was a story of an enduring historical significance. I've been a political staffer, so I've seen the political process up close. As a staffer and later as a journalist, I've handled confidential sources. I've also been a confidential source. I've twice been raided by the Australian Federal Police with leak inquiries that have seen the coppers turn up on my door at 6 o'clock in the morning. As a senior public servant, I've also commissioned the AFP to conduct inquiries to hunt down leakers. My perspectives on this, I've seen most sides of the fence. That doesn't necessarily lead to unique insight, but it has informed my view about all of this. And first starting point, since this is a conference about investigative journalism, was that my view about this has been that there was a big story out there, and that was the first and most important thing, a big important story, and that was that early last year, if you read what Julian Assange was saying very cryptically in his characteristic way in a couple of interviews, and what had been disclosed publicly in the partial disclosure of the chat logs between Private Manning and the FBI informant Adrian Lamo. By putting those things together, you could conclude, although Assange indeed denied it publicly, that WikiLeaks was sitting on a gold mine of immensely interesting, important and historically significant material that would tell people who read it a lot about how the world works, indeed how Australian politics and our alliance relationships with the United States would work. I may have been more tuned into that than some, given my background. I've been a diplomat, I've been a political staffer, and I could look at this and join the dots, though I can't say it was rocket science. So I concluded that there was a big story out there. It was probably going to be a big story internationally, but it would be one that had a significant Australian dimension. And I basically figured that that was something that would be worthwhile seeking out and delivering to Australian audiences, because this would be a significant part of understanding how our politics worked, how our diplomacy worked. Now, I've written briefly about the process of securing access to the cables and eventually going to see Assange in the United Kingdom. And for me, on initially looking at the material, I can say that as someone who's been inside government and inside diplomacy, I found pretty much what I'd expected to find. This was what the American diplomats going about their work would report back to their headquarters, and it provided a lot of insight that was both newsworthy and of enduring significance in aiding people's understanding of how the world works in the most basic sense. In the Australian context, you'd say, did it change Australian politics? Not significantly. I think probably it chipped the Labor government's popularity slightly, or its relative unpopularity, in the immediate aftermath of the election, but I wouldn't overstate that very much. But I think it's, in investigative journalism, I mean, it's nice if a story has a big impact, that it changes the big political reactions and the like. But I must admit, my viewpoint, which is in part informed by being trained as an historian, is that if you're really showing people how things work and things that they may not have known before, then I think you're doing your job in the most basic sense. It's good if there's a huge reaction, but the fundamental is, are you delivering a worthwhile story that people will sit down and read and take away? I think that's a worthwhile thing, and I think the Australian end of the Wikileaks cables told a lot of people. It gave them a first-hand insight into politics and diplomacy that they wouldn't have otherwise, that only the insiders have. And as someone who'd been inside, I found that it was less shocking, if you like, for me than for many other people, but it's precisely for that reason. It's the people who are outside the political establishment will look at this material and think, oh, I didn't know that, I didn't realise that. And I think that's a basic public good that was well served by this whole exercise, and I share the broad perception that's been expressed by the other speakers, that in that sense WikiLeaks, in the broadest sense, is a force for good. It's a force for good in terms of openness and transparency. What I wanted to do, because I know there'll be questions down the track, but was to just go back to a couple of the questions that Andrew addressed at the beginning of the speakers, and they were posed by Tom Morton. And they go particularly, I suppose, to the business to the question of the journalist craft and the business of dealing with sources. And one of those questions was whether or not the phenomenon of WikiLeaks and a particular model that have sought to establish of an anonymous electronic Dropbox into which people can put information and then have it published, and to afford sources of protection of that anonymity. How has that changed the business of journalism and dealing with confidential sources? And I think, reflecting upon all this, the first thing to conclude is that it is a small part of a much bigger transformation of the way in which society handles information. I'm not a technological determinist, because there are many factors that determine how society uses technology and develops it, but the explosion of IT technology is inevitably affecting all of our work, and that's actually the driver on these things. It's that governments and organisations can control and acquire and manipulate vast amounts of information, be it intelligence reports or diplomatic reports, can be handled in ways that were not possible before. When I joined the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade 20 years ago, they had just introduced an electronic cable distribution system. And for the first time, you could sit at your computer in the morning and could read the cables that had come in from right around the world. Prior to that, it had all come in hard copy. And you were surrounded by vast heaps of pieces of paper and paper files everywhere, which admittedly could be photocopied anonymously if someone was so minded. But nonetheless, information was much harder to move around. Those 250-odd thousand US diplomatic cables will fit on a single 2 gig USB stick with plenty of space. You can purchase that for, I think, about $10 these days, and you can put the whole database on one tiny little thing you can slip into your pocket. That technological transformation is changing, and the connectedness of the internet is transforming how journalists do their jobs. It's transforming how bureaucrats do their jobs. It's transforming how spies do their jobs. And Wikileaks is a part of that. As such, it opens up opportunities. That model opens up opportunities for journalists and investigators in terms of acquiring information and offering a form of confidentiality for sources and protection. But it's also the case that sources aren't just sources. They're people. And I can only underline the points that Andrew made at the beginning. They're people, whistleblowers. I haven't yet met a whistleblower who, to put it frankly, was not damaged in some way, overwhelmingly preoccupied, as they are such rare beasts. You think about the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands of people around the globe who possess secrets of organisations, be they governments or private organisations. The number who step forward to disclose something against the rules is vanishingly small. If it's Bradley Manning as the source of the WikiLeaks material, he's not 1 in a million, he's about 1 in 10 million. Now, it might be that in today's age, that one person can still deliver a vast trove of material, but they're still very rare. They're still ordinary human beings with all sorts of frailties. More often than not, journalists still need to deal with them as people and understand that they have their own agendas, which are sometimes virtuous. They're more often pretty complex. And sometimes you really need to think carefully about what your source is, who they are, what's their agenda, what are they delivering. Bradley Manning allegedly delivered this vast trove of material, but it is still only a partial image of US diplomacy. It is still only the cables from a particular database which have been selected for particular reasons by other people. And there is a vast trove of material that he did not deliver. That's a reality, but it's even the US cables, they are the perceptions of the writings of diplomats for particular purposes. The cables contain things that are true. They contain things that are not true. It's the perversity of this whole story that of all the Australian journalists to get the WikiLeaks cables, I was the only Australian journalist to rate a substantive mention in the WikiLeaks cables, which was a series of severely defamatory statements by a senior Defence Department official about myself. Now, I can say they're absolutely grievous falsehoods. And I looked at the document, and after laughing for a while and waking up the person on the plane sitting next to me, I reflected, I could sue this fellow. He has grievously defamed me. But admittedly, I'm not in the business of really thinking that journalists should be in the defamation game. But for me, it illustrated the fact, aside from the absurdity of it, that not everything in the cables is true. And that's where, in respect to the sort of scientific journalism question, I think by and large, journalists should, particularly given today's technology, load up as much of their source material as they can, within the certain practicalities. I think someone who's writing a breaking news story and needs to deliver it in the next 20 minutes is going to be more constrained in backing their particular script with supporting material than an investigative journalist working on a 6-month time frame and delivering a major piece of work. There isn't a single cloth to be cut for every circumstance. But we should load our stuff up, but we also need to interpret it and to explain it. And not only look at, say, here's the sources that back my story, but you also need to explain the sources to the reader, because those documents are not truth. Documents can contain lies and falsehoods. The falsehoods may themselves be significant. But nonetheless, where my own perspective is, as I've been trained as an historian, not as a journalist, I know that documents do not always tell the truth, or more often than not, documentary sources or other sources are a partial element of what has happened. Historians seek to reconstruct the past because you can't recover the past, you can't replay it. You can merely take the evidence that you can find and put it together and offer your best explanation for why things were or are as they are. So that interpretive role, it's not just a question of sort of objective evidence supporting story. You have to explain what your evidence is, where it's come from. And that goes to the question about anonymous sources. Wikileaks says that they don't verify sources, they verify documents. But as anyone who's dealt with real human sources and people delivering information, often you need to know who they are, what their agenda is, what their access to information is. And if you can't answer those questions, not infrequently you have a big question mark over what has been delivered to you. Sometimes the best leaks do come in a brown paper envelope or maybe an electronic drop box, but you always have to ask those questions. Where does it come from? What's the agenda behind it? Is it telling you the whole story? And in that respect, I think the WikiLeaks model is part of a broader set of skills and infrastructure and apparatus that investigative journalists and journalists in the broader sense need to have and need to be prepared to engage in. But it isn't a single model that will deliver the truth in the future, but a partial part of a much broader and interrogatory process in terms of dealing with information. And the other thing I'll come back to that Andrew spoke about was the question about Bradley Manning as the alleged source. As I said before, sources and whistleblowers, particularly people who are breaking the rules to release information, they're people who are one way or another taking risks. Amongst the ones that I've dealt with over the years, there have been people who would at least face serious criminal penalties if their action of disclosure went before the courts and they're convicted. They might well face loss of their job and income in some extreme circumstances, and I only know one in my experience is certainly a source that they've been in fear of their life. But they're people who are taking risks. They're taking risks for reasons which may be virtuous, which may be less than virtuous. Unless you get to know them and know who they are, I don't think you're doing your job to the degree that you should be. And it also means that with that there's a confidential exchange of information. I think that you have to accept that if you're doing your job, there's going to be a relationship between you and the source that involves elements of reciprocity. And that does actually go, although it's always a unique circumstance, beyond the simple question of confidentiality. There are certainly people that I've dealt with that were confidential sources, and extending back to my days before journalism, where I've had enduring relationships with them that have gone on for more than a decade. And that's because there's an enduring connection that's of significance. And I think that goes to being mindful about the risks people take and being mindful of their circumstances and telling them, if you're going to do this, these may well be the consequences. Not, thank you very much, I'll take that information, have a look and see what's in the newspaper next week, when the whole sky is going to fall in on someone. Now, it's no criticism of WikiLeaks to say that they weren't able to provide that support to someone like Bradley Manning. I think if you read what are purported to be the full chat logs, you find that Manning was a person with a whole range of complex personal issues that I think almost irresistibly led him to allegedly self-destruct in terms of disclosing what he'd done to a third party. The WikiLeaks model didn't, as I can see it, doesn't really allow you to have those relationships. That's in one sense part of its strength, but it's also its limitation. More often than not, as journalists, and my own personal experience, both as a journalist and political staffer, is you're dealing with people and you need to respect that and understand that they're people taking risks, You've got to try and work out who they are, why they're doing what they're doing, and you also have obligations to them, because the penalties can be very high indeed. In my own experience, I can reasonably say that I've had the coppers come in through the door and turn my place over twice, but it never resulted in the police having the evidence to pursue a confidential source for breach of the law. But the penalties can be very high. Manning in the United States might face anything from 10 to 25 years imprisonment. That's high stakes for anyone. In this country, if you're a federal public servant and you release information without authority, you can face up to 7 years jail. Most leaks are official leaks, actually covertly authorised by those in power, but some aren't. But the people who do that are taking real chances. And I think as journalists, we've got to be mindful of the human dimension. Sources are people, they're not just sources, they're actually real living people with families and their own preoccupations. And the price they can pay for years after a story has hit the headlines can be quite enduring. I'll close with one observation. Some years ago, there was a great political story which involved travel routes and the Howard government in 1997. There was a leak which was from a public servant who disclosed that a federal minister had been rorting his expenses. The leak was unquestionably illegal. It showed illegality. It was a genuine public-spirited whistleblower, and he leaked the information. And indeed, he leaked it to the MP that I was then working for. That material was then packaged up, analysed, and with accompanying spreadsheets showing on which weekends the MP had rorted his expenses, was then served up on a plate to a prominent journalist. And we did that because we knew it was a good story, and the best way of it having an impact would be to find a very authoritative figure and give him the story. And I think he got the Walkley, a gold Walkley in the following Walkley Awards. The back bit to this story is that the public servant who was responsible for this, he was never prosecuted. But the AFP hunted him for about 3 years, and he had people on his back, and he was looking over his shoulder for about 3 years before they went away, which, as someone who's also been investigated by the AFP, is a considerably stressful circumstance. And that fellow had done, in one sense, had done the right thing, had exposed corruption by a federal minister, but that didn't stop him from being hounded and harassed for a long period of time. And he had to carry that burden over the back. Another instance I know of, a whistleblower basically had his career wrecked through suspicion. So there's a high price to be paid. And I think that you need to be mindful of the human casualties in this and take every reasonable effort to deal with sources as human beings. Thanks, Philip. Question?
Yeah, there's just one question that struck me from listening in particular to Philip and Anthony. Philip, listening to your experience as a diplomat and a historian and how that has influenced your journalism, and then Anthony pointing out some of the gaps in the coverage of the mainstream press. Do you think the role of a generalist is diminishing? And what I mean by that is the days of having, the young reporter who covers all the different rounds and sort of is never really an expert in anything, but kind of does the trade and works their way up. I think now, from my analysis, watching the way journalism is moving and seeing how competitive it is, you're not only competing against the paper next door, you're competing against every other blogger out there, some of whom have incredibly niche information. Do you think that there is a place for a generalist anymore, or do you think we're going to see journalism becoming sort of incredibly siloed and actually economists and sort of new people like yourself, Philip, moving into journalism at a late stage?
Well, as a newcomer to journalism, and as someone whose professional training as a journalist would be limited to my attendance at this conference here today, I'm reluctant to express any authoritative opinion about the nature of the profession. I'd like to think of myself as still a cadet journalist. I'm still such a newcomer. But I've always seen myself as a generalist. I was trained in history, was where I went to university, and that was my skill set is history. And that as a basis for being able to conduct inquiries, you know, in the broader sense, I think it's probably not a bad training to then, by happen chance, to move into journalism many years later. So I don't see although I've got background in politics and diplomacy, I don't see myself as necessarily as a specialist in that area. Probably my knowledge helped in this particular instance, but I don't think that was decisive. And indeed, the subject of the WikiLeaks material is extraordinarily diverse. Within the Australian material, I've wrote stories relating from the ins and outs of federal politics to complicated diplomatic manoeuvres to intelligence assessments to the last one I did was on the pilotage regime for the Torres Strait and the government's winding back of environmental protections on the Torres Strait. So I'm a generalist. Perhaps other members of the panel might be more qualified to proffer a view about the profession. The one point I am prompted to pick up on was a point that was made about just the coverage of the Australian material. I think it's true to say the interesting thing about the WikiLeaks stuff is that most media outlets focus on their own backyard. The big papers, The Guardian, The New York Times, Le Monde, El País and Der Spiegel, had an overwhelmingly European, North Atlantic, Middle Eastern focus in their coverage of all that WikiLeaks stuff. They barely wrote any stories on China or East Asia or the Pacific, well, no stories on the Pacific. A senior journalist at The Guardian told me at a meeting between the various media outlets and the WikiLeaks people that said they weren't interested in Australia. They couldn't care less what happened to the Australian cables because it wasn't of interest to them at all. We didn't rate in their priorities. On the Australian end, most of the stuff I did was to cover the Australian cables quite comprehensively, and since I also had a good whack of material relating to the Asia Pacific, I wrote quite a bit of stuff on China, Indonesia, and more recently on the Pacific, which sort of covered our part of the world. I can't say that attracted a great deal of attention in this country, but certainly some of the China, Japan and Indonesian stuff got a fair reaction overseas, particularly when it was picked up by overseas outlets. But I think there's an old saying that all politics is local. A lot of media is local too, and the focus is inevitably on, you know, the Australian newspapers will always focus on what's immediately of Australian interest. But it would be nicer if we could all have slightly broader horizons. That's certainly my view.
Antony, did you want to say something else?
Just briefly, I think one of the things that often comes up for me, I mean, my background is I'm not really a specialist. I wasn't trained in any way. I did an arts degree in film, and I don't, write about film particularly now. So I think one of the best examples of journalism is really that you get bloggers or other people who are specialists to actually assist. So whether journalists are going to disappear, I suspect they might survive. It's hard to say, but I think the best journalists generally are the ones who aren't afraid to actually get help from people who know more than them. Because inevitably in any area, you don't know everything. I mean, it's an obvious thing to say, but you just don't. None of us do. So for me, for example, I did a lot of work about, say, the Middle East or human rights issues there. So a lot of bloggers or people who tweet or just individuals in human rights organisations, you have a relationship with them, often initially online. I've met some of them, in the Middle East in the last few years. But I think there is still a sense of a lot of mainstream journalists still not that keen to give those people appropriate credit. It's almost like you can speak to them, but the byline is still yours. And that sort of stuff needs to really change. I mean, yes, my name is on my book. It's not, co-authored by 20 people, but I think there is still a reluctance of giving up power. And the media that doesn't understand that the power dynamic is changing ain't going to survive, and nor should it, in my view.
Another question?
Anthony, you question why whistleblowers and leakers go to WikiLeaks and why WikiLeaks was able to get so many documents in such a short amount of time where the corporate press couldn't. But could it be that people who leak documents or whistleblow know that if they go to a news organisation, they will have to verify their claims and will be asked serious questions by journalists about what their motivations are? And could that be why more people do go to somewhere like WikiLeaks, where they can release information without having to undergo that same level of scrutiny? And whereas Julian Assange might be able to say, well, he can't possibly go through all the documents and can't possibly black out all the names, a news organisation could never get away with saying that, oh, we just didn't have time to verify our information, we just didn't have time to look at all the motivations. Is it really fair to compare the two?
I think people often forget that a lot of the stuff that WikiLeaks has released happened before the cables and diplomatic cables in Iraq and Afghan war logs, when they've been around for 4 years before that stuff happened. So most of the stuff that's been released is far more diverse. My point is not simply to argue that the corporate press has failed, full stop, and WikiLeaks has succeeded. Clearly, there are a lot of mainstream journalists who have broken wonderful stories, have and will continue to do so. I suppose to me, though, there is a sense often too much of a, and there are exceptions to this, but very much kind of an insider's club. Most of the so-called leaks in our press are not leaks. They're sanctioned leaks by media advisors. And it's not journalism, it's sort of press release rewriting, as most of us know. So the vast majority of stuff we see on the front page of newspapers, it's not journalism at all. It's simply crap that Liberal gives to a fellow journalist who is friendly. So if many in the mainstream press wonder why most people don't respect them, it's because of crap like that. And ultimately, if that is what is going to be lost by mainstream media leaving or lessening in power, we're not losing anything, in my view.
Just add something on that too. Don't get too carried away with the idea that journalists check everything that a source comes. Most of the rubbish that appears in the mainstream press are given to them, firstly are authorised leaks given by ministers or by press secretaries. They don't check any of it. They just bang it straight in the newspaper. And secondly, I don't see what the motivation of the source matters at all. All that matters is it accurate? I don't care what the motivation of a source is, provided that what they're telling or what they're giving is true and that it's worth publishing.
I'd agree with Brian in the sense that at the end it's your conclusion, but knowing the motivation of a source and knowing where they've come and what their access to information is, what the provenance of the material is an integral part, wherever it's possible, of assessing the information you've got in the hand. Often sources will only tell part of the story. They may well have a particular motivation, and they may only be giving you, press advisors will only tell what it is advantage to their boss. Well, sources too are not without their own particular motivation. Even whistleblowers have complex motivations, which are rarely summed up, very rarely down to simply, I think it's in the public interest to reveal this information. They're often quite complex, and the information that they provide, yes, it may well be the truth, but may also be only part of the truth. Or in some cases, it may actually, a whistleblower may actually be running a particular agenda that is quite disingenuous. And the really hot source that delivers something that looks really promising, but on inspection turns out to be a crock of shit, is not an unusual circumstance. So I think nothing beats finding out as much about what you've got. Maybe that reflects just some caution, but I think it's part of the due diligence, basically.
We are sort of coming towards the end of our session. Andrew, did you want to comment on that? Or
sure,
no? I know that we've got one more question. How many more questions? Three more questions. Can we have three more?
No, I think just a couple more minutes. We've got to be out of here.
Yeah, sorry about that. So, but you've been waiting patiently, so.
I pretty much agreed with all what you said, which is basically that WikiLeaks is doing some good to journalism, except one thing. Some of you said, stop me if I'm wrong, but that it was okay for WikiLeaks publishing the cables without protecting the sources. And your argument was basically that the US officials didn't, so it was okay for WikiLeaks not to, because the first fault was from the US officials. And I'm scared this will pretty much spoil all the good work that's done in WikiLeaks. Don't you?
No, I'm not worried about that. Why would you assume that anyone's going to be hurt or injured by this? This is just propaganda from the Americans about this. It is their fault if anyone gets hurt because they didn't do their job properly. But more to the point, how can WikiLeaks, how can a handful of people working for WikiLeaks work out whether someone's life is at risk or not? They can't. There's 250,000 documents here.
Well, so is your argument then that if that's the case, that they shouldn't be published? Is your argument then that sorry, but then you're saying that if what Brian says is right, then in fact they shouldn't publish because you shouldn't, if you're not sure, you shouldn't publish at all?
I thought they should publish it, but protecting the sources. It's not because the US officials didn't do their work and not protecting the sources.
Would you cross out the name of everyone who was mentioned in the thing? I mean, how do you even know who's a source, who's remotely at risk? If the American ambassador says such and such, is the ambassador the source? Is the ambassador at risk, you know?
I don't know. I thought WikiLeaks could take the security to do it and they would have nothing to say against WikiLeaks then, but if you say it...
At the end of the day, WikiLeaks released all of the unredacted cables after they'd already gone up on the web and had become accessible. And while there's much argument between WikiLeaks and The Guardian about the responsibility for that, the fact is that The Guardian breached one of the most simple and basic rules of cryptologic security when a prominent Guardian journalist put the password in his book. And it's a no-brainer to know that that was an extraordinarily stupid thing to do. I think once the cables were all up on the web and accessible by security services and intelligence agencies and any reasonably computer literate person to access the entire database, at that point I think WikiLeaks was indeed, if anything, responsible in their actions and actually putting the whole lot up in an authoritative source. By that stage, The Guardian had let the horse out of the paddock and absolutely bolted.
We'll have to leave it there for today, but if you do have any further questions, I'm sure that the panel would be happy to discuss them, I think, over drinks once we're finished and out of this room. But the conference starts again at 9:30 tomorrow, so hope to see you all back there then.